Hi everybody, we're going to go through chapter 1 materials from your book for this semester's classes. Does everyone have a Diet Coke ready to go? Okay, here we go. At the very basic level, what we're talking about this semester is communication. Like right now, I am the source of the message and I'm using two different media to get my message to you. I'm using my voice, right, but I'm also using Screencast-O-Matic, which is the software I'm using, and I'm using YouTube, and we're using the internet, and you're using your laptop or your phone. Okay, so there's a lot of different media that you might be using to get my message. And I'm sending it to you, the receiver, with an intended effect. Like my intended effect is to get you excited and interested about chapter 1. That might not actually be the effect. And that's a big lesson to learn when we're studying the mass media, because the intentions of the message don't always match the effects. Okay, so the mass media then are the groups that produce large amounts of information, typically electronically, to a large audience. So what I'm doing right now is not mass media, but what the Huffington Post does on the web is mass media. Now, there's a main difference between what I'm doing and what the mass media do. Their purpose is to make money. And that's something that's going to catch you all in class, because I'm going to say, okay, what's the purpose of the mass media? And somebody's going to say, to educate or to inform or to entertain. And I'm going to say, no, no, no. No, the purpose of the mass media, 99% of the time, is to make money. And that is the underlying intent behind every message that they send you, is to make money. Now, I've had students say, well, Ms. Smith, isn't the purpose of your message to also make money because I'm getting paid to do my job? Well, please don't tell the administration that I would actually do this job even if they didn't pay me, okay? All right, so what you're looking at right now is the very basic communication model. Couple words that I want to make sure that you are familiar with from this model is that the sender encodes a message, the receiver decodes it. All of us decode messages in a different way. We have baggage that we carry with us that keep us from completely receiving a message the way it might have been intended. Also, noise is not just physical and literal noise in that sense, but also, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Oh my gosh, I can't think what the word is. What's the word? Not literally, but
figuratively.
Thank you. Thank you. My 13-year-old son just helped me. Figuratively. Noise. Also, like you might have, he's laughing at me now. You might have the TV on while you're watching me. You might be listening to music while you're doing this. You might be bored in class, although you never will be. You might be daydreaming in class. You might have just gotten in a fight with your parents or your boyfriend so that you aren't really able to pay attention to the message that I'm sending you. And that's noise, figurative noise. And then there's also literal noise that might keep you from getting a message. Right now you might have a bad internet hookup. I mean, there's all sorts of things that keep us from getting the messages that we are intended to receive. What's cool now about the electronic communication model is that we can provide feedback so quickly. You know, if I saw something on TV when I was in high school that I didn't like, I would get out a piece of paper and the typewriter. And then I'd have to get out the yellow pages and look up the address of the station. And then I would have to get a stamp. And then I'd have to go to it. It was long and drawn out. Now, what kind of feedback options do we have? Oh my gosh, so many. If I don't like something, I can get on Twitter and have it fixed within 5 minutes. It's awesome. Awesome. So feedback now has really, really changed. Something else I want you to remember about feedback is that it can be positive and negative. You know, like when I'm looking at positive feedback in class, I'm looking at eye contact, people nodding, that I can tell that they're with me. But sleeping in class is also a sort of feedback. You know, if you all aren't with me in class, I know that I'm doing something wrong. So we all, like really good message producers, are very in tune with feedback, because that's how we figure out how to change the message to make it more relevant. Does that make sense? Okay. The number one thing to remember from chapter 1 is that the mass media are different because they are profit-based. If you remember nothing from this semester, remember that. They are profit-based. Their purpose is not to educate you, not to inform you, not to entertain you. Their purpose is to make money for their stockholders. And later on in the semester, we'll talk about how really only 4 companies in the world own everything in the media. And they're making a crazy amount of money. And yet we think we're being entertained and informed. We're not. Well, we're kind of entertained and kind of informed, but we'll get to that later. All right. So typically when I tell people what I teach, they say, oh, you're right, the media is awful. And I always respond, you know what, that's not what these courses are about. Media is so pervasive, meaning that it's everywhere. Why shouldn't we analyze it? Here, over 7 hours a day, the American home typically has a TV on. So, of course, we should study that, right? I'm not saying that it's good or bad. I'm saying it's so huge in our lives, we need to analyze it. This is not a class where we're going to bash the media. There will be parts of the media that we do bash, but that's not what this course is about. Okay, 11 hours and 38 minutes with the mass media daily. And I've seen many people do 2 or 3 different media at a time. For me now, I do a lot of secondary TV watching, so that I'll be on Twitter, but watching TV in the background, or on Twitter and listening to music, or listening to music while I'm online. There's very rarely a time when we are ingesting just one form of media, and that's why we can make it almost 12 hours a day. This survey kind of freaks out people typically when I tell them, and yet it's not surprising that a kid would choose TV over their dad, because what does TV ask of you? What does TV ask you to do? Nothing. Sit and relax. Dad might ask you to do a chore or tell you about his day or do your homework. TV asks nothing of us. So, of course, many kids are going to choose TV over their dad. It makes sense. There are a lot of TV bashers that cite reports that excessive TV viewing has been linked to all of these issues. Obesity, yeah, I get that. A lot of these aren't necessarily surprising. Increased risk of substance abuse typically surprises some people, and they automatically assume that it's because there's drug use and alcohol use on television. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily it. I think it might have something to do with the relaxing feeling of just sitting in front of the TV, how it alters our mood. And isn't that kind of a definition of a drug, is that it alters our mood? So maybe if we watch a lot of TV, we expect our mood to be even keeled and relaxed all the time. I don't know, though. We can talk about that in class. I think that this particular stat is way off. Way off. My kids would most likely prefer to play video games than watch TV, and I am totally fine with that. I'm kind of a weird mom when it comes to that, because I love video games because they're not linear. They're not a linear story. Who's in charge when you're playing a video game? It's you. In many cases, you've actually created the map that you're playing on. So I think video games are fantastic for creativity and planning. I get all excited when my kids, join together to kill Nazis. I think they're fantastic. He's laughing at me again. But I think 90 minutes each day is probably short. And, the average person that plays video games is 35. So to say that it's a kid playing 90 minutes each day, I think that that's a little misleading. This is an old study about sex on TV, but I think it's still important, and I can't find a more recent one, so maybe I'll just have to do one myself. There's a lot of sex on TV. Everybody knows that. The thing that's interesting, I think, about the sex on TV, at least from what I've gathered from the last few years, is 2 things. It's kinkier. Very few married couples have sex on TV. In fact, there are very few happily married couples on TV at all, which we'll talk about that later. Not much contraceptive use, and there's also no real discussion about emotional impact of sex, sexual activity. And, you know, when you go back to the statistic saying that we're ingesting media, you know, almost 12 hours a day, what kind of messages are kids getting? They're not hearing that sex is good necessarily. They're just hearing that there are no consequences to it, either physical or emotional consequences to it. And we all know that there are. Also, what's interesting too is that you know, the number of people in the world that are virgins compared to the number of people on TV that are virgins, completely off kilter. So if you're not sexually active, you watch TV and you think there must be something wrong with you because everyone else is. And that's not necessarily true. We'll talk about that later too. Yeah, are you sick of me saying that? We'll talk about that later. It concerns me that Americans get a lot of their political news from television. Television is a visual medium, which means that TV news will only cover visually interesting stories, and typically politics is kind of boring because it's about policy. So to get a visually interesting story, television will typically lean on scandal and those candidates who are telegenic rather than actual real information. All right, so let's talk about culture. What is our culture exactly? Well, remember from, you know, 7th grade social studies, culture is what gives us information about what's right and wrong, what's appropriate, what's good and bad, what's attractive and unattractive. There's a really neat study that I'm going to show you in class about different versions of beauty depending on what culture it comes from. Our culture was passed on typically by our parents and our grandparents, right? I mean, think back to like tribal leaders where they would tell stories orally about their culture. Then we moved to a print culture, so we were learning about our culture through reading. Now we have a visually based culture. And who is telling us our stories about ourselves? Who are the storytellers in our world now? Well, it's the mass media. So back up to 5 minutes ago. What's the main purpose of the mass media? It's to make money. So our primary storytellers in our culture do not have our best interests at heart. Their job is to make money, not necessarily to pass on the culture. So we get a weird mix of culture in our world. Here's just little snippets, some of my favorite things. But throw all this together with McDonald's and Oprah and every other brand in the world, oh, and Diet Coke, and you get a great image of what American culture is, and it's primarily built and constructed by the mass media. All right, so how does our culture define success, beauty, intelligence, alcohol use, wealth, political success? These are all questions that are worth asking, because what your grandparents might tell you about what it means to be beautiful is going to be completely different than what your Glamour magazine is going to tell you, or what The Biggest Loser is going to tell you. Different definitions of success, right? Wealth, I mean, think about it. In our culture, it's more important to look wealthy than to actually have money in the bank, okay? Also, I think that it changes our definition of intelligence. There really aren't very many smart people on television. They might be glib and smart alecky, but not real intelligence, deep emotional intelligence, especially now that Oprah's not on the air, right? Here's my favorite quote from George Carlin ever, and this is the whole basis of what you're going to hear me talk a lot about. It's media literacy. That means that we critically evaluate everything that we consume. We question it. So to be media literate, it doesn't mean that you hate the media. It just means that you question everything. And you do that by asking questions. Who created this message for me? What was their motive or intent? Am I the target audience? What part of the message was left out? And why? What tools did they use to create this message to get me to feel a certain way? These are all questions that you should ask yourself about every single media message that you consume. And I love it when students come up to me after class or after the semester and they'll say, God, I can't watch TV in the same way anymore. And I say, yes. I mean, I love TV, but I probably watch it differently than you do, so that's my goal. All right, so why do we study the mass media? Because it's pervasive, it's everywhere. It can manipulate us emotionally. And you know what? If you're sitting there right now saying that the media do not manipulate you emotionally, tell me that you sat through Toy Story 3 and did not cry, because I don't believe you. I don't believe you. I didn't watch Marley and Me because I knew the dog died at the end. I can't put myself through that. Saving Private Ryan, greatest movie ever. Do I cry every time I see it? Oh yeah, in the same 5 spots every time, but I still watch it. Now this slide is mainly about sadness and being emotionally wrecked by a media production. But think of all of the other emotions that media can pull out of us. Like during the World Cup, during the Olympics, during news coverage about what is happening right now in Gaza and Israel, or the Ukraine, or a plane crash. We can be frustrated and angry and curious or excited. Baseball games, hockey games. I mean, everything has an emotional impact on us. And when we learn how we are manipulated emotionally, don't you think that makes us smarter consumers and less likely to be manipulated? Absolutely. Okay, so there's some terms you need to know. In the past, we had the big 3 networks. When you hear the term big 3 in your book, that's what they're talking about. NBC, ABC, and CBS. So that when I was in high school, those were our options. 3 channels. Get your mind around that. 3 channels, okay? Now, obviously, the ratings of the big 3 networks have all dropped because they have competition now. There are other things. There's 100 other channels and a gazillion other things we can do online. So the big 3 networks' ratings are all dropping. Television has competition now that it did not have before. That has led to something called audience fragmentation. Your book says that audience fragmentation is a bad thing. I'm not convinced necessarily. But the idea behind audience fragmentation is that now, instead of all of us watching one of 3 things at night on television, we could be doing a million different things. And so critics of audience fragmentation are saying that that's separating our culture too much, that we don't have that much in common anymore because we can all go into our little electronic caves and do our own thing. So I'll leave that to you to decide. But some terms that I want you to know. Oh, I don't know why that's not fitting. Sorry. Broadcasting was the first 3 networks, right? Trying to reach the largest audience ever. Largest audience possible. That's broadcasting. That led to something called narrowcasting. The very first network to ever narrowcast was MTV. They didn't try to reach the largest possible audience. They went for teenagers. Now, why wouldn't they want the largest possible audience? Why would they choose to just go for teenagers? Well, that means they could go to advertisers and say, you know what, I can only get you 2 million viewers, but every single one of those 2 million viewers is in your target market, and advertisers will say, okay. Which is why when you're watching MTV, you don't see ads for Geritol or adult diapers or baby food. You see ads for products that teens use. Mountain Dew, Proactive, oh yeah, you name it, okay? That's narrowcasting, and it's genius, and MTV did it first. Now, think about a typical cable or satellite TV lineup. Every single channel now is a narrowcasted channel. The Golf Network, come on, has a really, really small rating. However, if I sell Callaway golf clubs, I'm going to advertise on the Golf Network because those are my people. I'm not going to try to advertise on a big show on NBC. It'd be a lot of people, but not necessarily the people who are going to buy my golf clubs. So narrowcasting is relatively new and genius. Narrowcasting then merged into something called microcasting. Microcasting is what you experience when you log on to Amazon. And it says, hello, Julie Smith, we have these recommendations for you. And guess what? I always want the recommendations. Because who has given them the suggestions for the recommendations? Me. No one else's Amazon login page looks like mine because of microcasting. It's just to me. Think about Pandora for you. How many Pandora stations do you have? Do you have the same list of stations of anybody else in the whole world? No. Think about your Facebook page, the ads that show up on your Facebook page. Those are microcasted just for you based on the information you've already given Facebook about yourself. Microcasting is genius and cheap. So we've seen kind of an evolution here from reaching the largest possible audience to a tiny, tiny little audience of 1. Another term you need to know is called media convergence. Basically what that means is that all forms of old media are now available on new media. And this is a fun little illustration of it because think about it. On your phone, you can do everything that all of those machines used to do on the top. And it's in your pocket. Another example of media convergence would be how sometimes after movies have been out for a while, they show up on TV. Or you can watch TV shows online. Okay. Typically, the media tend to gravitate towards whatever the newest form is. Selective exposure is something that we'll talk about almost every week, and I apologize in advance, but it's so important. The idea behind selective exposure is that we will only expose ourselves to messages in the media that we know we will agree with and will make us feel comfortable and warm and fuzzy. That is why my liberal friends only watch MSNBC and hate Fox, and that is why my conservative friends only watch Fox and hate MSNBC. Why would they expose themselves to messages that they disagree with and are going to cause them cognitive dissonance, which is a fancy word for saying mental discomfort? Why would they do that? So MSNBC knows their market, Fox knows their market, and they cater to them effectively. Selective exposure is kind of a cool thing because we have so many options, right? But when it comes to election years, selective exposure is dangerous. Dangerous because we're never challenged. Our assumptions and beliefs are never challenged. And we're almost done. How you doing? You holding up okay? All right. The Big Mac theory is kind of a fun theory, I think, because I love Big Macs and I love the idea behind it. The idea behind Big Mac theory is that we love low culture. Now, your book mentions high culture and low culture. We love low culture so much that we've dumbed it down and just made high culture now low culture. We don't really care for ballet as a culture, but we love Dancing with the Stars. We love So You Think You Can Dance. Okay? We don't really read heavy literature like Bram Stoker's Dracula, but we'll watch the Twilight movies and we'll eat Count Chocula. Okay? And look, even my favorite author, Jane Austen, is in on it because we don't read Jane Austen, but we read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies because it's a mashup of old things and new things within the culture. Okay, so how y'all doing? You okay? That was basically the highlight for the first week, chapter 1 in your book. So I will see you in class. Let me know if you need anything.